It's increasingly becoming a violent crime where people are assaulted in the process of stealing vehicles.
A temporary 2-year cap on new international student permits.
Pull together, as we did a number of years ago, a Team Canada approach, standing up for Canadian values and Canadian interests.
The Prime Minister closed out his cabinet retreat here in Montreal today, announcing a new Team Canada led by Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne, aimed at navigating the possibility of Donald Trump Part 2. That follows an announcement for an auto theft summit and a cap on international students. But some breaking news took over Cabinet's agenda today with a federal court ruling that the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act was, quote, unreasonable because there was no national emergency to justify its use.
I was certain, after a lot of deliberation with colleagues and many others, that we took the right decision. I was certain at the time. I was certain when I testified before Rouleau, and I remain certain today.
You heard there the feds say they're going to appeal, but what implications are there for them on this politically, and will it impact the political punch they were hoping to land here with this cabinet retreat this week in Montreal? Let's bring in the front bench to talk about that. With me this evening, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt is here. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is in the chair right next to me here in Montreal, and the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie is with us as well. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Before we get into the politics of this, Lisa, I thought I'd get your take first on your view on the relative significance of today's decision by the federal government. Is it significant from where you sit, and if so, why?
It is. It's significant in a couple of ways. It's significant because now the federal cabinet really has to pay attention to this court case and the fact that it's going to be going to an appeal. And of course, it should go to appeal. Probably will go to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I guess if you thought that you had all this tied up nicely and wrapped up in a bow with the federal inquiry that happened, boy, you did not anticipate this court case going in the direction that it did. And what it is jurist took a look at the tests of reasonableness and made his determination that it was not a reasonable use and that people's charter rights were breached. And it is a big deal, Vashi, because individuals will now feel vindicated. And boy, the political parties are going to fundraise like you can't believe off of this.
And my understanding is that, many of those individuals who did feel like their rights, Brian, were contravened now could potentially have the opportunity to sue the government in light of the decision today. Lisa also said, though, something that kind of piqued my interest, right? Like, if I had bet some money on what issue would throw the government off their agenda, which they were trying to be incredibly disciplined about at this retreat, I don't think I would have picked the convoy. I didn't think that was going to be the thing that threw them off. What does it say that it did end up sidesweeping today's agenda, and what kind of challenge does that present going forward?
There's got to be some size coming out of that cabinet retreat, only because I think that was sort of the vibe that the Trudeau government and the Liberals were feeling in 2023, and they were hoping that the page had been turned on the idea that there's all these sort of external things happening, some things that we'll argue were internal and unforced errors, but things that were taking them off their message. So I definitely believe that they're very hopeful for 2024 that they'll stay on message a lot more than they were able to do last year. So to your point, yeah, I mean, we probably wouldn't have predicted that this would have been the thing to take them off their message. Probably the message today that they were hoping to get out of the retreat the most, trying to frame the U.S. election as a huge issue for Canada, which of course it is, but obviously trying to make that a bit more of a focus on the domestic politics coming up for the next year or two, depending when the next federal election will be. On that, though, I do think that the dynamics of the U.S. and the U.S. election will still be something that's at the forefront of the minds of Canadians. But I do agree with what Lisa mentioned. This will give some fodder to the opposition. It will certainly be a talking point that they can use to continue to paint Trudeau as somebody that's caused issues for Canadians. So obviously something that I think would have drawn a lot of size today.
I'm not, Rob, naive enough to think every Canadian is glued to the every moment of a cabinet retreat. But I do think that there was a concerted effort in this one versus the last one to actually say a few things about stuff that people are worried about, particularly in the immigration policy side of things. They actually made an announcement about a cap. Do you think anything that they did or the messaging around it had an impact for them politically?
Yeah, I think a little bit, Vashi, and I mean, because unlike Charlottetown last summer, they actually had some tangible announcements, whether it was on international students or whatever. At least it's something that was headline grabbing and had all of us talking about. I mean, as to whether this ruling today derails the government from its agenda, I'm not sure it does, because I think anytime you're talking about the convoy protests, not necessarily bad for Justin Trudeau or good for Pierre Poilievre. I always thought that Trudeau's finest moment as Prime Minister, frankly, was his testimony at the Rouleau inquiry. He actually looked serious and learned and not the kind of glib, fast and loose guy that some Canadians perceive him to be. So I'm not really sure that talking about this ruling is going to be necessarily bad for the government. I think there's no other G7 country in the world that would indulge protesters for weeks and weeks and weeks to basically blockade their capital city. If this were Paris or Washington or London, those protesters would have had their trucks dragged into the river, and they would have been cleared with tear gas. I just think that and I'm glad that didn't happen, because I don't think that's what Canadians would want. But I think one judge saying something different to what another judge said in a public inquiry, I don't think is particularly detrimental to the government, frankly.
What do you think about that, Tom? Because there's a lot of law degrees on this panel. I'm certainly not one of them, but you know, how I mean, it is one judge, and I totally take all that Rob's saying, but it's a decision from the federal court. It likely will, it will be appealed, and then it will head even higher.
I think that the best measure of what Rob just said is the fact that Pierre Poilievre put something out on X, on Twitter, that was, by his standard, relatively subdued. I mean, he was crowing, but it didn't break your eardrums. He was saying, see, I told you, Trudeau overstepped his bounds. And Lisa's right that this thing has to go to the Supreme Court. So I think that the lawyers in justice are going to be looking at whether or not the federal government should actually just refer this straight to the Supreme Court with a reference case. Okay. And I think that just shortens the time, because you've got two very credible judges, two thoughtful decisions that come to the exact opposite decision. Rouleau got there saying, yeah, barely, but okay, I'll say you were okay to invoke it. With regard to Mosley today, Mosley, by the way, who's finishing his last weeks on the job because he hits 75 years old in early May, very respected judge, always had a tendency to rule in favor of what he saw was the important issues of rights. He did that again today. I think that this thing is mature, because it's not just for this cabinet, by the way, it's for any future cabinet. Yeah. If nobody knows what those rules are, well, how do you invoke? And you're faced with a convoy that's saying, oh, we're not leaving until we've changed the government. Really? And you can't do anything about that with the existing legislation? Maybe the legislation has to be changed as well. So it was a bombshell. I don't think it sucks all the air out of the room for this cabinet retreat, but it was certainly one of those proofs. It's like live television, you never know exactly what's going to happen. You thought you've done a pretty good job. You're about to put a bow on it, and then this thing goes kaboom right at the last minute.
Yeah, you thought Trump was going to be the constant, and that would be your bow, and lo and behold, not even that worked. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break. The front bench is sticking around. We're going to turn our attention